China is accusing the United States of being in no position to attack its human rights record. Senior Chinese and American diplomats are meeting in Alaska today. It's the first high-level face-to-face talk since President Joe Biden took office. Beijing's representatives say the US is deeply hypocritical, emphasising human rights in America are at a low point.
And the challenges facing the United States in human rights are deep-seated. They did not just emerge over the past 4 years, such as Black Lives Matter. It did not come up only recently. So we do hope that for our two countries, it's important that we manage our respective affairs well, instead of deflecting the blame on somebody else.
The US delegates point out there are serious concerns about China's actions in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, as well as cyber attacks and economic coercion.
These are the concerns that are on the minds of the American people. But it goes beyond that. We've heard each of these concerns from around the world, from our allies and partners and the broader international community.
To talk more on this, joining me live, Simon Jackman, CEO of the US Studies Centre. Great to have your company again. Part of the interest in this exchange, this trading of barbs, is that it's been reported US officials got cameras back in the room to see what was going on here.
Pardon me, Tom. What's remarkable there, Tom, in that short set of grabs you played, is that the Chinese bring someone from their so-called Commission on Human Rights to this dialogue. Number one, and number two, the response from Jake Sullivan there that we saw, that in replying to the Chinese on that very issue, in the grab, the reference to allies and partners. It's allies and partners in the region have these same concerns that we do, and America is constantly pointing out, referring to allies and partners, and Australia chief among them, as part of its secret sauce. This is not just us against you, China, the United States is saying. These concerns are shared broadly around the region and around the world, something that China struggles to say when it wants to point the stick back at the United States.
Right, and this sort of caps off what's been a huge week in Australia-US relations. There was the Quad meeting between leaders for the first time, obviously, and also these comments from the US that we won't normalise relations with China until China stops punishing Australia over trade because of concerns that Australia has put out there. That's a huge commitment to make, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Tom. It was really significant that on the eve of this event in Alaska, while the Secretary of State, Blinken, and the Secretary of Defense, Austin, were visiting their counterparts in Tokyo and Japan, that there was this loud shot across the bow from Kurt Campbell, the so-called Indo-Pacific czar in the White House, and a long-time friend of Australia, and just making that point to the Chinese: don't expect concessions from us while you're out there punishing one of our closest and most important allies in the region, Australia. And joins, Tom, comments by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who we just heard from speaking to the Chinese there in Anchorage, about the strong ties between Australia and the United States and how important they are to America's strategy with respect to China going forward. And I guess, Tom, the question for us, and something we're tracking awfully carefully at the United States Studies Centre, watching those sentiments, and those strong sentiments indeed, and voices of support for Australia, convert into action in the days, weeks, months, years ahead. In particular, something we're keeping an eye on, what will the US defence budget look like going forward? And indeed, within that budget, what will be the prioritisation given to kit and to presence from the United States out here in the region? The extent to which the global superpower, the United States, can really muster not just words, but the focus of its military, the focus of its State Department back to the region to back up that sentiment about Australia in the region with facts on the ground. And we welcome the sentiment, and we eagerly await it being backed up by those so-called facts on the ground.
Yeah, I guess that might also lead to calls on our own defence budget. We'll see. On a broad picture, though, I mean, let's remember the commentary around whether or not Scott Morrison cozied up too much to Donald Trump. Would the Democrats punish him? In particular, as well, our strong stance on COVID and having this inquiry. Now, clearly that cost us in terms of trade with China. You can debate whether language should have been better. That's fine. On the flip side, it's shown to the US. They seem to be saying now, you really did carry the can here. We were impressed. We're committed to you in turn.
Yeah, so Tom, it's something we at the US Study Centre had an awful lot of visibility on. On the one hand, Team Australia, led by the Ambassador Joe Hockey at the time, playing a very personal game, which I think was absolutely the right way to deal with the Trump administration. Pull them in as close as you possibly can and remind them of the importance of the Australia relationship. That did not cost us on the Democratic side of the ledger. I think everybody in the United States strategic affairs community looked at what we were doing and could also see at the same time, not just the way we were managing relationships with the Trump administration, but at the same time, the hard yards a trade-exposed country like Australia was prepared to take with respect to China. And that, in addition, I think, and perhaps more importantly, won the respect and the admiration and the gratitude of a lot of people that are now in government, of Tony Blinken, of Jake Sullivan, of Kurt Campbell, these people that are really driving US policy towards the region, and a broader set, Tom, whose names are less familiar, but up there in Congress. Members of Congress, we have done a tremendous job as a country of reminding that really important part of the DC community, not just the White House, but Congress as well, about the hard yards Australia has been doing. And so we came to the Biden administration. Yes, we'd done very well under the Trump administration, but it was more about the substance of what we were doing than I think it was the partisan element of that, hockey brokering a really strong relationship with Trump officials.
Yeah, and going, I guess, as people have been saying, well beyond leaders of the day. Hey, very briefly, we're not perhaps going to be embarrassed on climate by the US, given it's going to be a slow move then perhaps on that. But the vaccine's not a slow move right now.
Yeah, so it's an interesting element to it, Tom. It's something, again, we're tracking awfully closely. So much angst in Australia that the Biden administration would call Australia out, would somehow embarrass us. We're being out of step with the rest of the world, or even the United States. That being the fear, I think, on climate change. If anything, I think the thing we're increasingly keeping an eye on, Tom, is the rate at which the vaccine rollout is happening in the United States. And maybe Australians might be starting to put our vaccine roll up alongside the tremendous uplift in the vaccine rollout in the United States, and wondering, well, if a country like the United States that only a couple of months ago seemed a real basket case when it came to COVID, they're finally starting to round the corner. When does Australia start to really put the hammer down on vaccine rollout? And I guess that's the challenge ahead over the next couple of weeks we'll see in Australia on that one, Tom.